I used to believe that the greatest achievement of my life wasn't the house my husband and I built, or the savings we spent decades putting aside. It was my son. Daniel was born on a rainy October morning, and from the moment I held him, every decision I made revolved around giving him the kind of life I never had. I worked extra hours as an elementary school teacher. My husband, Thomas, took every overtime shift he could find. We skipped vacations, drove old cars, and celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, because every dollar we saved was meant to give Daniel a better future. And for a long time, I believed it had. After Thomas passed away 5 years ago, Daniel started visiting more often. He'd fix a leaky faucet, mow the lawn, or bring groceries without me asking. Whenever I thanked him, he'd smile and say, "That's what family does, Mom." Those words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket. I never questioned them. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was walking downstairs after my nap when I heard voices drifting from the kitchen. Daniel and his wife, Melissa. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I almost announced myself. Then I heard Daniel laugh. $850,000, he said. Can you imagine? Once it's ours, we can finally stop worrying about money. Melissa answered with a quiet chuckle. Just don't get ahead of yourself. People notice when children start acting excited before the parent is gone. My feet refused to move. For a moment, I honestly wondered if they were talking about someone else. Then Daniel said the words that shattered every illusion I'd been holding on to. Mom has no idea how simple this is. She still thinks I'm here because I miss her. I felt the air leave my lungs. The grocery bag slipped from my hand, but somehow neither of them heard it. I turned around before they could see me. Back inside my bedroom, I locked the door, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the framed photograph of Thomas, smiling beside me. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted with what I had to do next. I dialed his number. "Michael," I whispered when he answered, "I need to change my will." Michael didn't ask questions over the phone. He simply said, "Come by my office tomorrow morning." When I hung up, I expected to feel angry. Instead, I felt heartbroken. I kept replaying Daniel's words in my mind, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood them. Mothers have a strange habit of making excuses for their children, even when the truth is standing right in front of them. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen, pretending nothing had happened. Daniel looked up from the coffee maker and smiled. "Morning, Mom. I made your favorite." A week earlier, that smile would have melted my heart. Now, I found myself wondering whether it was meant for me or for the $850,000 he believed would someday be his. "Thank you," I replied quietly. Melissa joined us a few minutes later, cheerful as ever. She asked about my doctor's appointment, reminded me to take my medication, and even hugged me before leaving. It looked like love. It sounded like love. But after what I'd overheard, every kind gesture felt rehearsed. Every smile carried a question I couldn't ignore. Was this genuine or an investment? That afternoon, I met Michael at his office. He'd handled our family's legal matters for nearly 20 years. When he saw my face, he didn't offer small talk. He simply closed the door and waited. "Tell me what's happened," he said. For the first time since Thomas died, I cried in front of someone. Not because I was losing money, not because I wanted revenge, but because I realized I had spent years believing my son came to see me out of love, when he might have been counting the days until everything I owned became his. When I finished, Michael remained silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. "Eleanor, changing your will is easy." He paused. "The difficult part is deciding what kind of legacy you want to leave behind." I looked out the window and wiped away my tears. "I don't want to punish my son," I said softly. "I just want him to understand that love was never something he was supposed to inherit." Michael nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure your final words say exactly that." Was this genuine or an investment? That afternoon, I met Michael at his office. He'd handled our family's legal matters for nearly 20 years. When he saw my face, he didn't offer small talk. After my meeting with Michael, I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't make any decisions based on a single conversation. If I'd misjudged Daniel, I wanted to know. If I was right, I needed to accept it. So I began paying attention. Not to what he said, to what he did. It didn't take long. One evening, he stopped by carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. He kissed my forehead, asked how I was feeling, and spent nearly an hour chatting about work. For a brief moment, I felt ashamed of myself. Maybe grief had made me suspicious. Maybe I'd heard those words out of context. Then, as he stood to leave, he looked around the living room. "Mom," he said casually, "have you ever thought about selling this place? It's probably worth a fortune now." I smiled politely. "Your father loved this house. So do I." "Sure," he replied with a shrug. "I just mean, eventually, someone will have to deal with it." Eventually. Such a harmless word. Unless you're the one being quietly counted down. A few days later, I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist. The tests came back better than expected. "Keep taking your medication," my doctor said. "There's no reason you can't enjoy many more healthy years." I walked out smiling. But when I mentioned the good news over dinner, Daniel's smile lasted only a second before disappearing. "That's great, Mom," he said. Great. He said the right word. His face told a different story. That night, lying awake in bed, I finally admitted the truth I'd been fighting for weeks. My son wasn't waiting for more time with me. He was waiting for what came after me. The realization didn't make me hate him. It broke something much deeper. Because the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, the teenager who once promised he'd always take care of me, the young man who cried at his father's funeral, somewhere along the way, he'd been replaced by someone I no longer recognized. The next morning, I called Michael again. "I'm ready," I told him. There was no hesitation in my voice this time. "Let's finish what we started." Michael had already prepared the paperwork by the time I arrived. He slid the documents across his desk, but didn't hand me a pen. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Are you absolutely certain?" I looked down at the papers. This wasn't just a legal document. It was the final chapter of everything Thomas and I had spent 43 years building together. I closed my eyes for a moment. I could almost hear my husband's voice. Protect what we worked for, but never let money destroy your heart. That was the difference between Thomas and me. He always knew how to separate love from guilt. I was still learning. When I opened my eyes again, I signed every page without shaking. Michael placed the documents into a folder and locked them inside a cabinet. From this moment on, he said, only you and I know what's written in these papers. I nodded. I'd like it to stay that way. He smiled gently. It will. As I drove home, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel angry anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful. Not because I'd taken something away from my son, but because I'd stopped allowing fear to make my decisions. Over the next few months, life settled into a quiet routine. Daniel still visited. Melissa still brought flowers. They still asked if I needed anything. And I treated them with the same kindness I always had. I never argued. I never mentioned the will. I never let them know I'd overheard that conversation in the kitchen. If they were pretending, then so was I. One rainy afternoon, while organizing old photo albums, I found a faded picture of Daniel at 7 years old. He was missing his 2 front teeth, proudly holding a wooden birdhouse Thomas had helped him build. On the back of the photograph, Thomas had written in black ink, "The greatest inheritance we can leave our son isn't money. It's the values he chooses to live by." I traced the words with my fingertips until my eyes filled with tears. Thomas had been right. Money never changes a person's character. It simply reveals it. I slipped the photograph into an envelope and wrote 3 words across the front. For Daniel. Then I placed it in the same drawer where Michael had told me to keep one final document until the right time. Winter arrived sooner than expected. My health began changing in quiet ways. I tired more easily. Simple walks became shorter. Even climbing the stairs felt like more effort than it once had. My doctor was honest with me. "There's no emergency," he said, "but it's time to slow down and enjoy the people you love." I smiled. I intended to. Daniel started visiting even more often. He brought groceries every Sunday. He insisted on driving me to appointments. He even offered to organize my financial paperwork so I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. A year earlier, I would have called him the perfect son. Now, I couldn't stop wondering why his kindness always seemed to appear whenever money entered the conversation. One afternoon, he stood in my study holding an old folder. "Mom," he asked, "where do you keep the important documents? Insurance, property papers, things like that." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. "Somewhere safe." He laughed awkwardly. "I was just thinking ahead." "I know," I answered. And I did. A few weeks later, I invited Daniel over for dinner. Just the 2 of us. No Melissa. No distractions. We talked about his childhood. About the fishing trips he and Thomas used to take. About the Christmas morning when he begged for a bicycle we could barely afford. For a little while, he wasn't the man chasing an inheritance. He was simply my little boy again. As he stood to leave, I hugged him longer than usual. "I love you," I whispered. He hugged me back. "Love you too, Mom." I wanted those words to be true. More than anything. A month later, I quietly passed away in my sleep. There was no pain, only peace. The funeral was beautiful. Friends shared stories. Neighbors cried. Daniel stood in the front row, accepting hugs and condolences with tears in his eyes. No one questioned his grief. No one noticed how often his eyes drifted toward Michael, my attorney. As though he wasn't waiting for one final goodbye. He was waiting for the reading of my will. A week after my funeral, Daniel and Melissa walked into Michael's office, believing the hardest part was already behind them. Family photographs lined the walls. The room was quiet, almost respectful. Michael greeted them with the same calm expression he'd worn for more than 20 years. After everyone had taken a seat, he opened a thick folder. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks updated her estate plans several months ago, he began. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. He hadn't expected that. Still, he remained confident. Michael continued reading. The house, the savings, the investment accounts. Everything had been carefully listed. Daniel sat a little straighter with every sentence, already imagining what his future would look like. Then Michael stopped. He reached into the folder and removed a smaller envelope. Across the front, written in my own handwriting, were 3 simple words. For Daniel. The room fell completely silent. Michael looked toward my son. Your mother left instructions that this letter be read before the remainder of her wishes are explained. Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Michael folded the letter. Then he began reading my words. My dear Daniel, if you're hearing this, then my time has come, and I hope one day you'll remember me for the love I gave you, not the things I owned. Daniel lowered his eyes. Your father and I spent our lives building this estate, not because we wanted to leave behind wealth, but because we wanted to leave behind security. Michael paused only long enough to turn the page. The greatest disappointment of my life wasn't growing old. It was realizing that somewhere along the way, you began measuring my life by what it would someday be worth. Daniel's face lost its color. Melissa slowly reached for his hand. Neither of them spoke. Michael looked up before reading the final paragraph. There is one last instruction your mother asked me to share. He took a slow breath, then looked directly at Daniel. And it changes everything. Michael unfolded the final page. The room was so quiet that even the ticking clock seemed louder than before. Then he continued reading my words. Daniel, if you're expecting this letter to punish you, you've misunderstood me one last time. I have never stopped loving you. Not when you were a little boy who held my hand, not when you became a husband, and not even after I overheard the conversation in my kitchen that changed my heart forever. Daniel's head snapped up. His face turned pale. He finally understood. I had heard everything. The day I realized you were waiting for my estate instead of my company, I didn't lose my son. You lost your mother long before I took my last breath. tears rolled down Daniel's face. For the first time, they weren't tears for an inheritance. They were tears of shame. Michael looked down at the will. Mrs. Brooks directed that her home be sold. A large portion of the estate will establish the Thomas and Eleanor Brooks Scholarship Fund, helping first-generation college students who cannot afford an education. He turned another page. The remaining assets have been placed in a protected trust. Daniel looked up, confused. "A trust?" he whispered. Michael nodded. "Yes, you are the beneficiary." Hope flickered across Daniel's face. Then Michael finished the sentence. "But only after completing the conditions your mother left behind." Daniel frowned. "What conditions?" Michael handed him the final page. "For 1 year, you must volunteer every month at the community center where your mother taught children to read. You must complete the service without payment and without using your name for publicity. If you refuse, your share will be donated to the scholarship fund." Daniel stared at the page. His hands trembled. There was no argument left to make. No loophole to exploit. Only a choice. Money, or the values his parents had tried to teach him his entire life. As Michael gathered the papers, he quietly added, "Your mother ended her letter with one final sentence." He read the last line aloud. "An inheritance can buy comfort, but only character earns a legacy." I hope those words stayed with my son far longer than the money ever could. Because in the end, my greatest gift was never the $850,000 I left behind. It was one final chance for my son to become the man I always believed he could be.